Measuring the cost of living. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, measures the typical consumer's cost of living. The basis of cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, as you might have heard them called before, CPI is the basis for the cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, as you may have heard of before, in many contracts and also in Social Security. You may eventually have to ask your employer for a cost of living adjustment to your salary. You can use CPI to illustrate just how much your salary should be adjusted. So this should be a chapter that you're somewhat interested in if you're interested in earning higher salary over time. So let's talk about how CPI is calculated. First step is, quote-unquote, fix the basket. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, surveys consumers to determine what's in a typical consumer's shopping basket. Think of a shopping cart. Okay, what are you putting in there? Well, then we find out what we're going to buy, typically, and then we're going to find the prices. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects data on the prices of all the goods in our typical basket. Milk, eggs, bread, things, cereal, things you all put into your shopping carts. Okay. Thirdly, we compute the basket's cost. We use the prices to compute the total cost of the basket. What's our basket of goods that we'd like to get actually costing us? Next, we choose a base year, like we talked about in the previous chapter, and compute the index. The CPI in any equal year equals the cost of the basket in the current year over the cost of the basket in a base year in percentage terms, so we multiply it by 100. So again, the cost of the basket in the current year, what it took you to put your items in that basket today versus what it took you to put those items in your basket and buy them last year or 10 years ago, whatever the base year is. Lastly, we compute the inflation rate, the percentage change in CPI from the preceding period. The inflation rate is the CPI this year minus the CPI last year divided by the CPI last year. So everything's in terms of the previous year. So this year minus last year divided by last year, put in percentage terms when we multiply by 100. Now, let's do an example to help make this thing a little more apparent, hopefully. We have 3 years, 2010, 2011, 2012. We have two items, pizza and lattes. Okay, we have different prices for those years, $10 in 2010, and it went up to $11 in 2011, $12 in 2012. The latte went from $2 to $2.50 to $3. Now, let's assume these are the things you put in your basket. 4 pizzas and 10 lattes make up your basket. Now, in real terms, the BLS does a calculation on a much broader range of items. Now, the cost of the basket, then, if this are the two things you're putting in your basket, are $10 times the 4 pizzas and $2 times the 10 lattes, $60. Okay, that's the cost to buy what you want to buy, 4 pizzas and 10 lattes this year in 2010. Now, in 2011, it's $11 times 4 and $2.50 times 10, $69. Cost has gone up. Basket costs you more. 2012, $12 times the 4 pizzas and $3 times the 10 lattes for a total of $78. All right. Now, we can compute CPI in each year and get the inflation rate. And here, an example, we're using the base year, or using 2010 as the base year. Okay. Now, in 2010, we take the 100 times 60 over 60 because that's the cost of our basket in the base year and the cost of our basket this year. We get 100. Okay. 2011, cost of the basket is $69 and the base year was 60. Again, we're using 2010 here as the base year. We get 115, multiply it by 100, put it in percentage terms. And then lastly, we use the base year again of 60, and the current year for from 2012 is $78. Okay, from this. So $78 divided by 60, multiply by 100. Okay, get 130. Well, the difference between 100 and 115 is 15%. The difference between 115 and 130 is 13%. Okay, now this could equally be computed by the CPI here. 115, the current year, minus the base year. Okay, actually the previous year. Okay, so 115 minus 100. We're going back to right here. Okay, first calculation we made was here. Second calculation we're making is here. So 115 minus the previous year divided by the previous year times 100 is 15%. So it's another way to calculate that. All right, and the current year 130 right here, calculated here from here. Okay, 130 calculated here, minus the previous years, which is 115. Again, calculated using this, and now we're calculating this, which is the same as this. Okay, 130 minus 115 divided by 115. So the previous year divided by the previous year. The current year minus the previous year divided by the previous year to put into percentage terms. So the change from year to year, from 2010 to 2011, is the cost of your basket went up 15%, and the cost of your basket from 2011 to 2012 went up 13%. So that's our example. Let's work a problem. Let's take a look at the CPI basket where we're getting 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken. Okay, small basket, we're just buying meat here. All right, 2010, 2011, 2012, we see prices of beef and chicken change. They go up in each year. The CPI basket costs $120 in 2010, which is going to be our base year. So in 2010, to get 10 pounds of beef, we pay $4 per pound, and to get 20 pounds of chicken, we pay $4 per pound, and we get our market basket of beef and chicken costs $120 in 2010, which is going to be our base year. We can compute the CPI for 2011. We can also answer the question of what the CPI inflation rate was from 2011 to 2012. Part A is not all that difficult, but requires an intermediate step. You must compute the cost of the basket in 2011 to find the CPI for 2011. Part B has two intermediate steps: computing the cost of the basket in 2012, and then computing the CPI for 2012. So again, we have two calculations we have to make in that part. Okay. Again, here's our basket: 10 pounds of beef, 20 pounds of chicken. Here's our prices. 2010, the basket costs $120 in the base year. We're going to compute CPI for 2011. The cost of the CPI basket in 2011 is the price, $5. Times the pounds of beef we want, 10, plus the price of chicken, $5, times the pounds of chicken we want, 20. It's $150. Now the CPI in 2011, therefore, is the current year divided by the previous year times 100. The CPI score is then 125. Now in B, same scenario. But we're doing a different calculation here. What is the inflation rate from 2011 to 2012? The cost of the CPI basket in 2012, okay, very simple calculation. The price of beef times the quantity of beef, the price of chicken times the quantity of chicken for that year. We creeped up to $210. Okay, it's going up. CPI in 2012 then is the previous year divided by the base year. Okay, 210 divided by 120. Times 100, which is 175. Okay, now we can calculate the CPI inflation rate. Whereas before we had a base rate in the calculation, we didn't have to make the CPI inflation rate calculation. So we have 175, which is the current year, minus 125, which is the previous year, divided by the previous year of 125. Okay, we get a CPI inflation rate of 40%. Okay. That price to get beef and chicken is going up, right? Okay, so if your costs are going up for things you have to buy and say in your market basket, you need to have a corresponding increase in your income to keep up with the market. Otherwise, it's not like you're not getting a raise. If you don't get a raise, you're actually losing money. You're getting a pay cut because the things you want to buy with your wage are actually becoming more expensive. So it's a really important thing to keep your mind on. Now, what's in a real CPI basket? Okay, you can see it broken down here in a pie chart. Food and beverage, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education, and communication, and other goods and services. Each number is the percent of the typical household's total expenditure. For example, 41% spent on housing. Now, I could ask you for examples of how to break down your own expenditures and how it differs perhaps from the typical household shown here. And then I could ask you how a typical elderly person's expenditures might differ from what's shown here. This is relevant because CPI is used to give Social Security cost of living adjustments to the elderly. However, the elderly spend a much larger fraction of their income on medical care, a category in which prices grow faster than CPI grows. The website... The Bureau of Labor Statistics website also gives a very fine disaggregation of each category. So if you wanted to break down a little more about CPI, you could take a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which would enable you to compare your own spending to the individual goods of a typical household. Your spending will change over time. There are two measures of inflation from 1960 to 2013. The red one is the GDP deflator. The CPI is the blue line here. This figure shows the inflation rate, the percentage change of level prices as measured by GDP deflator and also the consumer price index. Notice that the two measures of inflation generally move together. There are a few years where they diverge a bit. The reasons for this are on the next slide. We're going to talk about this here in a bit. GDP deflator figures we got from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and CPI we're getting from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor. Both series are quarterly, and the inflation rate is calculated as a percentage change from one year to another. The monthly CPI is aggregated into quarters by averaging monthly values, so they kind of put them on the same scale here. So pretty close, but there's some divergences here. Okay, let's talk about those reasons now. Now, contrasting CPI and GDP deflator, imported consumer goods are included in CPI but excluded from GDP deflator. Okay, little apples and oranges there. Capital goods are excluded from CPI but included in the GDP deflator if produced domestically. Okay. The basket, CPI uses a fixed basket, which for all the reasons we talked about before can be overstating of the CPI. Okay, things in the basket may change, and it won't change as quickly as you change what's in your basket. GDP deflator uses baskets of currently produced goods and services. Okay, it's a little more inclusive. This matters if different prices are changing by different amounts. Very dynamic situation, trying to take a static look. Now, active learning exercise part 3. CPI versus the GDP deflator. In each scenario, determine the effects of CPI on the GDP deflator. In scenario 1, Starbucks raises the prices of Frappuccinos. In part B, the heavy equipment manufacturer Caterpillar raises the price of the industrial tractors it manufactures at its Illinois factory. In part C, Armani raises the price of Italian jeans it sells in the U.S. Okay, these have a plethora of potential effects on the market, but they also change CPI and GDP. All right, so maybe take a moment, think about those, and then we'll proceed to the next slide. Now, if Starbucks raises its price of Frappuccinos, CPI and GDP deflator both rise. Okay, they're both consumption items, so consumer prices are going up. The consumption aspect of GDP is going up. Now, if Caterpillar raises the price of industrial tractors it manufactures at its Illinois factory, the GDP deflator rises because they look at that as inventory, as an investment in inventory. But the CPI does not account for a Caterpillar tractor. Okay. Counts for the market basket. It's hard to fit a Caterpillar tractor into a market basket. Armani raises the price of Italian jeans it sells in the U.S. CPI will account for this because it's looking at the consumer price index. It's looking at the price of things like Armani jeans and American retailers. Okay, GDP, there's nowhere to put that. Okay. It's either they can already have Armani jeans in stock, they could have sold them, so it would be consumption, but the deflator is not going to account for the fact that Armani just rose the prices unless they actually sell them. Okay, so again, in A, Frappuccinos are produced in the U.S., so their prices are part of GDP deflator. They are purchased by consumers, so their prices are part of CPI. Hence, an increase in the price of Frappuccinos caused both CPI and GDP deflator to increase. Part B, since the tractors are produced here in the U.S., the price increase causes GDP deflator to rise. However, industrial tractors are a capital good and not a consumer good, so CPI is unaffected. It's a capital, not consumer. Part C, Italian jeans appear in the U.S. consumer's shopping basket, and hence their increase in their price caused CPI to rise. However, the GDP deflator is unchanged because it only includes prices of domestically produced goods and excludes the prices of imports. So, in some cases, CPI and GDP deflator count the same thing. In some cases, GDP counts it and CPI does not. In some cases, CPI will count it and GDP deflator will not. So it's two very different measures trying to get at similar items. One is looking at how prices rise, and the other one is looking at how an economy is performing, how the economy has income from all of its goods and services.